The explosion lit up the night sky in cascades of gold and silver, reflecting off Crystal Lake like liquid fire. 20,000 people cheered from the shoreline as the grand finale thundered overhead, but all I could focus on was the look of absolute fury on Linda Blackwood's face as she screamed at me from her kayak in the middle of the lake. "This is illegal," she shrieked over the booming mortars, her perfectly styled hair whipping in the wind from the concussions. "I'm calling the sheriff. I'm calling the fire department. You're going to prison for this." What Linda didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, as she paddled frantically toward my launch barge, was that I was the one who had issued every single permit for this fireworks display. As the county's director of special events licensing, I had personally signed off on every form, every safety inspection, and every legal requirement needed to make this the biggest 4th of July celebration in the county's history. But let me back up 18 months, because this story starts with something much smaller, a sparkler. My name is David Chen, and I'd been living on Crystal Lake for 12 years before Linda Blackwood moved into the massive McMansion directly across from my modest lakefront cabin. For over a decade, my family had hosted a small Independence Day gathering, maybe 30 friends and neighbors. Some grilled burgers and a few modest fireworks launched from my private dock. Nothing crazy. We're talking about basic consumer fireworks, fountains, Roman candles, and maybe a dozen aerial shells that you could buy at any fireworks stand. The kind of celebration that happens in backyards across America every 4th of July. Crystal Lake was a natural amphitheater, surrounded by rolling hills and dotted with about 40 homes spread along 3 miles of shoreline. The community had always been informal, friendly, and respectful of each other's property rights. We didn't have an HOA, didn't need one, and most importantly, didn't want one. That changed the day Linda Blackwood decided she needed to control everything she could see from her lakefront deck. Linda was what you might call aggressively suburban. She'd moved to Crystal Lake from some planned community in Dallas, where every mailbox was regulation beige and every lawn was measured for compliance. Within 2 weeks of moving in, she was knocking on doors, introducing herself as someone who brought order to chaos and asking pointed questions about property values and neighborhood standards. The first red flag should have been when she asked me about getting permits for my fireworks business. "It's not a business," I explained, standing on my dock while she floated nearby in her pristine white kayak. "It's just a family tradition. We've been doing this for 12 years. Linda's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Well, traditions change, David, especially when they affect property values and community safety." I didn't think much of it at the time. Every neighborhood has one person who complains about everything, and I figured Linda would eventually settle in and relax. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was underestimating just how far she was willing to go to get her way. 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. Linda had somehow managed to form a Crystal Lake Homeowners Association, complete with bylaws, covenants, and restrictions that supposedly governed every property around the lake. According to the letter, my annual fireworks display was now classified as a commercial pyrotechnic event that violated noise ordinances, safety regulations, and aesthetic standards. I had 30 days to cease all unauthorized explosive activities or face legal action. The letter was signed by Linda as the democratically elected HOA president, though nobody I talked to remembered voting for her or even being asked to join an HOA. I called my neighbor Jim Patterson, who lived 2 houses down and had been coming to my fireworks parties for 8 years. "Jim," I said, "did you vote to create an HOA?" "What HOA?" he replied. Linda came by asking if I wanted to formalize neighborhood communications, and I said sure, thinking she was talking about a phone tree or something. Next thing I know, she's sending me invoices for membership fees. As I talked to more neighbors, the picture became clear. Linda had approached each homeowner individually, describing her neighborhood improvement initiative in vague terms that sounded harmless. Most people had signed what they thought were simple communication agreements, not realizing they were actually joining a homeowners association with Linda as the sole board member. The legal language in those agreements was ironclad. Linda had essentially tricked 40 families into giving her authority over their property use, and she was planning to use that power to transform Crystal Lake into her vision of suburban perfection. But here's what Linda didn't know about me. I wasn't just some guy who liked fireworks. I was David Chen, the county's director of special events licensing, and I had been dealing with HOA legal challenges for the past 15 years. I knew exactly how these fraudulent associations operated, and I knew exactly how to fight them. The first thing I did was request copies of all the HOA formation documents from the county clerk's office. What I found was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. Linda had filed incorporation papers listing herself as president, secretary, treasurer, and sole board member. The bylaws gave her unilateral authority to issue fines, liens, and legal demands without input from any other homeowners. Most damning of all, the election that supposedly made her president had taken place at a board meeting that only she had attended. But Linda's biggest mistake was targeting my fireworks display. She had picked a fight with the one person in the county who understood both sides of the permit process better than anyone. As the director of special events licensing, I processed applications for everything from county fairs to concert venues to professional pyrotechnic displays. I knew every regulation, every loophole, and every legal precedent that governed public events in our jurisdiction. More importantly, I knew that Linda's newly formed HOA had absolutely zero authority to regulate permitted events on private property. So I decided to give Linda exactly what she was asking for, a fireworks display that was completely legal, properly permitted, and absolutely impossible for her HOA to stop. The plan I developed was beautifully simple. Instead of hosting my usual backyard gathering, I would apply for a county permit to hold a full-scale public fireworks display on Crystal Lake. The event would be free to the public, professionally managed, and conducted under the direct supervision of the fire department. Linda's HOA covenants might restrict unauthorized explosive activities, but they couldn't override a county-issued permit for a legal public event. And as the person responsible for issuing such permits, I was in the perfect position to make sure everything was done by the book. The application process took 3 months and involved more paperwork than most people see in a lifetime. I had to submit detailed site plans, safety protocols, traffic management studies, environmental impact assessments, and insurance documentation worth millions of dollars. Every form was filled out perfectly. Every requirement was exceeded. Every safety standard was met or surpassed. By the time I was finished, my fireworks display would be the most thoroughly documented and legally bulletproof event in county history. But the real genius of my plan wasn't the legal protection, it was the scale. Instead of 30 friends in my backyard, I was planning an event that would accommodate 20,000 spectators. Instead of basic consumer fireworks, I contracted with Thunder Bay Pyrotechnics, the same company that handled the city's New Year's Eve celebration. Instead of launching from my small dock, I would use a professional barge positioned in the center of the lake for maximum visual impact. Linda wanted to stop my fireworks display? Fine. I'd give her a fireworks display she'd never forget. The first sign that my plan was working came in November, when Linda received a copy of my permit application through the county's public notification process. She called me within an hour, and I could hear the panic in her voice. "David," she said, trying to sound reasonable, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. When I said no fireworks, I meant your little backyard parties. I didn't mean you couldn't have any fireworks at all." "Actually, Linda," I replied, "you were very specific. Your violation notice said I had to cease all unauthorized explosive activities. So I'm authorizing them through the county instead. But this is insane. 20,000 people? Professional pyrotechnics? You're going to destroy the neighborhood. The event is fully permitted and meets all safety requirements, I said in my most official tone. If you have concerns about the permit application, you're welcome to file a formal objection during the public comment period. Linda filed 17 objections over the next 2 months. Each one was carefully reviewed, thoroughly researched, and ultimately rejected for lack of merit. Her claims that the event would cause irreparable harm to property values were contradicted by tourism studies showing that public events actually increased lakefront property desirability. Her arguments about noise violations were undermined by decibel measurements, proving that the fireworks would be quieter than the motorcycle rallies that pass through town every summer. Her environmental concerns were addressed by a comprehensive cleanup plan that would leave the lake cleaner than before the event. By February, Linda was getting desperate. She hired a lawyer, an expensive one, from Dallas who specialized in HOA enforcement. He sent me a threatening letter claiming that my fireworks display would violate the quiet enjoyment provisions of the HOA covenants and demanding that I cancel the event. I forwarded the letter to the county attorney's office with a simple note: please review this attempt to interfere with a legally permitted county event. The county attorney's response was swift and decisive. He sent Linda's lawyer a letter explaining that HOA covenants cannot supersede county permits and that any further attempts to interfere with a fireworks display would be considered harassment of a county employee. Linda's lawyer stopped responding to her calls after that. But Linda wasn't finished. In March, she escalated to what I called the nuclear option of suburban warfare. She started attending county commissioner meetings. Every Tuesday at 7 p.m., Linda would appear at the podium during public comment period with a new conspiracy theory about my fireworks display. One week, I was supposedly planning to damage the lake's ecosystem. The next week, I was creating a public safety hazard that would require emergency services from 3 counties. Her most creative accusation was that I was using my position as special events director to give myself preferential treatment in the permit process. She demanded that the county conduct an internal investigation of my conflict of interest. The commissioners did investigate, and what they found was exactly what I expected. My permit application had been processed through the standard review channels, with additional scrutiny applied because of my position. If anything, I had been held to a higher standard than typical applicants. Commissioner Sarah Rodriguez summed it up perfectly during the April meeting. Mr. Chen has followed every regulation, exceeded every safety requirement, and provided more documentation than we've ever seen for an event of this type. Mrs. Blackwood's objections appeared to be personal rather than procedural. That's when Linda made her biggest mistake. She stood up in the middle of the meeting and screamed at Commissioner Rodriguez, accusing her of being part of a conspiracy to destroy Crystal Lake's character. The outburst was caught on the county's livestream and went viral on local social media within hours. Linda Blackwood became infamous as the fireworks Karen, who had a meltdown at a county meeting over a 4th of July celebration. But the real turning point came in May, when Linda tried to organize the other Crystal Lake homeowners into a united front against my fireworks display. She called it a Save Our Lake meeting and held it at the community center, complete with printed flyers and a PowerPoint presentation about the dangers of my event. According to Linda's invitation, the meeting would feature expert testimony about pyrotechnic safety and environmental impact. What Linda didn't expect was that most of her neighbors were actually looking forward to the fireworks display. Jim Patterson stood up during the Q and a period and addressed Linda directly. I've been going to David's fireworks parties for 8 years, and they're the highlight of our summer. Now he's upgraded it to a professional show that the whole county can enjoy. and you're trying to stop it because you don't like loud noises? Margaret Foster, who lived at the north end of the lake, was even more blunt. Linda, you moved here 6 months ago and immediately started telling everyone how we should live. David's been part of this community for 12 years. If you don't like fireworks, maybe you should have bought a house somewhere else. By the end of the meeting, Linda was facing a room full of neighbors who were tired of her controlling behavior and excited about the biggest event in Crystal Lake's history. Her Save Our Lake coalition had turned into a Support David's Fireworks rally. The final nail in Linda's coffin came in early June when the local newspaper ran a feature article about my upcoming fireworks display. The headline read, "County Employee Brings Professional Pyrotechnics to Crystal Lake for Free Public Celebration." The article included interviews with Thunder Bay pyrotechnics about their safety protocols, comments from the fire chief about proper event management, and enthusiastic quotes from my neighbors about the community's spirit of the celebration. Linda was quoted exactly once, saying that the event would change the character of the neighborhood forever. The reporter's response was perfect, according to longtime residents. Mr. Chen's annual fireworks tradition has been part of Crystal Lake's character for over a decade. By the time July 4th arrived, Linda had exhausted every legal challenge, every bureaucratic obstacle, and every community ally she could find. The fireworks display was going forward exactly as planned, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The morning of the event, I arrived at Crystal Lake at 5 a.m. to oversee the setup. Thunder Bay Pyrotechnics had brought in a crew of 12 technicians, a professional launch barge, and enough fireworks to light up the entire county. The fire department had stationed safety boats around the lake, and the sheriff's department was handling traffic management for the expected crowds. By noon, cars were already arriving from 3 counties away. Families spread blankets along the shoreline, vendors sold ice cream and kettle corn, and local musicians provided entertainment on a small stage we'd set up near the boat launch. The atmosphere was like a county fair, but with the natural beauty of Crystal Lake as the backdrop. Kids were swimming, teenagers were playing volleyball, and adults were catching up with neighbors they hadn't seen all year. Linda spent the entire day pacing on her deck, making phone calls, and occasionally yelling complaints across the lake that nobody could hear over the sounds of celebration. As the sun began to set, 20,000 people had gathered around Crystal Lake for what would become the most spectacular 4th of July celebration in the county's history. At 9 p.m. sharp, the first rocket launched from the barge and exploded in a shower of red, white, and blue sparks. The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the lake, and for the next 30 minutes, the night sky was transformed into a canvas of color and light. The professional fireworks were everything I had hoped for and more. Massive aerial shells burst overhead in perfect synchronization with patriotic music broadcast from speakers around the lake. Waterfalls of golden sparks cascaded from the sky, reflecting off the lake's surface like liquid fire. The grand finale featured a sequence of enormous chrysanthemum bursts that lit up the entire valley and drew applause that lasted 5 minutes. But the moment I'll never forget came halfway through the show, when Linda Blackwood launched her kayak and paddled furiously toward the barge, screaming about illegal activities and threatening to call the authorities. The sight of this woman in her pristine white kayak, paddling through a lake surrounded by 20,000 cheering spectators while professional fireworks exploded overhead, was so absurd that even the pyrotechnics crew started laughing. Sheriff Deputy Martinez, who was stationed on one of the safety boats, intercepted Linda before she could reach the barge. The interaction was brief but decisive. "Ma'am, I heard him say over the radio, you need to return to shore immediately. You're interfering with a permitted county event." "This is my lake," Linda shrieked. "I'm the HOA president. Ma'am, this is a public waterway during a county-sanctioned event. Please return to shore or I'll have to escort you." Linda spent the rest of the fireworks display sitting in her kayak at the edge of the lake, glaring at the celebration, while 20,000 people enjoyed the show she had tried so hard to stop. The aftermath was even more satisfying than the fireworks themselves. The next morning, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about the success of the Crystal Lake fireworks display, complete with color photos and quotes from delighted spectators. The headline read, "Record crowds enjoy professional fireworks at Crystal Lake." Linda Blackwood wasn't mentioned in the article. By the end of July, 3 families had approached me about buying property around Crystal Lake specifically because of the fireworks display. Property values, which Linda had claimed would be damaged by the event, actually increased by an average of 8% over the next 6 months. The Crystal Lake fireworks display became an annual tradition that grew larger each year. What started as my response to one woman's attempt to control the neighborhood became the county's signature Independence Day celebration, drawing visitors from across the state. But the most satisfying part of the whole experience was what happened to Linda's fraudulent HOA and the domino effect it triggered across the entire county. The morning after the fireworks display, I arrived at my office to find 17 messages on my voicemail from homeowners around the county who had seen the news coverage and wanted to know how they could fight their own OA problems. The first call I returned was from Janet Morrison, who lived in Willowbrook Estates about 20 miles from Crystal Lake. Her voice was shaking as she explained her situation. "Mr. Chen," she said, "I've been following your story in the newspaper, and I think my HOA president is doing the same things that woman did to you. She formed an association without proper consent. She's charging illegal fees, and now she's threatening to foreclose on my house because I won't pay a $2,000 fine for painting my front door the wrong shade of blue." I spent an hour on the phone with Janet, walking her through the same legal research process I had used to expose Linda's fraud. Within a week, we had documented evidence that Willowbrook Estates HOA had been formed using the exact same deceptive practices Linda had used at Crystal Lake. The pattern was identical. Individual homeowners had been approached with vague neighborhood improvement agreements that were actually HOA membership contracts in disguise. The president had appointed herself to all board positions without a legitimate election. The bylaws gave her unilateral authority to impose fines and fees without oversight. Janet's case became the second domino to fall. When we exposed the Willowbrook fraud, it triggered investigations into 12 other HOAs across the county that had been formed using similar tactics. What we discovered was a network of suburban dictators who were essentially running the same scam in different neighborhoods. They would target established communities without HOAs, trick residents into signing fraudulent agreements, then use their manufactured authority to extract money and control from their neighbors. The mastermind behind it all was Linda's lawyer from Dallas, the expensive one who had tried to stop my fireworks display. He had been marketing these neighborhood improvement packages to aspiring HOA presidents across North Texas, providing template documents and legal strategies for forming associations without proper consent. When the state attorney general's office learned about the scope of the fraud, they launched a statewide investigation that ultimately exposed over 200 illegitimate HOAs and resulted in criminal charges against the lawyer and several of his clients. But Linda's personal downfall was even more dramatic than I could have imagined. In August, several homeowners who had been tricked into joining the Crystal Lake Association filed complaints with the state attorney general's office about deceptive business practices. The investigation revealed that Linda had violated multiple laws in the formation of her HOA, including fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. The association was dissolved by court order, and Linda was ordered to refund all membership fees and fines she had collected. Several homeowners filed civil lawsuits against her for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But the real bombshell came when investigators discovered that Linda hadn't just been running a fraudulent HOA, she had been embezzling money from her previous job in Dallas. It turned out that Linda had been fired from her position as office manager at a medical practice after being caught stealing from patient accounts. She had used the embezzled money to buy her lakefront mansion, and her desperate need to maintain her lifestyle had driven her to create the HOA as a new source of illegal income. The FBI got involved when they traced the money trail, and Linda was indicted on federal charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Her lakefront mansion was seized as proceeds of criminal activity, and she was facing 20 years in federal prison. Linda's lawyer, bills from fighting the fireworks display, combined with the legal costs of defending against the HOA fraud charges and the federal criminal case, reportedly exceeded $200,000. The trial became front-page news throughout North Texas. Linda's attempt to stop my fireworks display was presented as evidence of her pattern of using fraudulent authority to control and intimidate others. The prosecutor played audio recordings of her threatening phone calls to county commissioners and showed video footage of her meltdown at the public meeting. The most damaging testimony came from her own neighbors at Crystal Lake, who described how Linda had systematically targeted anyone who questioned her authority. Margaret Foster testified about receiving threatening letters demanding payment for landscaping violations that existed only in Linda's imagination. Jim Patterson described how Linda had tried to fine him for parking his work truck in his own driveway. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Linda guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $300,000 in restitution to her victims. But the story gets even better. During the investigation, authorities discovered that Linda's husband had been completely unaware of her criminal activities. He had believed that the HOA fees and her previous job had provided their lifestyle, and he was devastated to learn that their entire life together had been built on stolen money. He cooperated fully with investigators and testified against Linda at trial. As part of a plea agreement, he was allowed to keep their car and personal belongings, but everything else was liquidated to pay restitution to Linda's victims. The most satisfying moment came when the federal marshals auctioned off Linda's lakefront mansion to pay her legal debts. The winning bidder was a consortium of Crystal Lake homeowners who had pooled their money specifically to ensure that Linda's house went to someone who would be a good neighbor. They sold the property to the Austin family I mentioned earlier, the ones who were excited about the annual fireworks display. The new owners turned out to be exactly the kind of neighbors Linda should have been: friendly, respectful, and committed to the community. The Austin family, Mark and Jennifer, became regulars at the annual fireworks celebration and eventually volunteered to help with event coordination. Their teenage daughter, Emma, even wrote her senior project about how community events bring neighborhoods together, using our fireworks display as the primary example. What Linda tried to destroy with her fake authority, Emma wrote, Mr. Chen rebuilt with real community spirit. The fireworks aren't just about celebrating Independence Day, they're about celebrating our independence from people who try to control us. The success of the Crystal Lake fireworks display had ripple effects that extended far beyond our small community. The county commissioners were so impressed with the event's positive impact that they allocated funding for a permanent Crystal Lake special events budget line item, ensuring that future celebrations would have professional support and resources. The tourism revenue generated by the fireworks display helped fund improvements to the entire Crystal Lake area, including new boat ramps, upgraded roads, and a permanent concert pavilion that hosts events throughout the summer. Property values around the lake increased by an average of 23% over 3 years, making Crystal Lake one of the most desirable addresses in the county. But the most meaningful outcome was the transformation of our community culture. Linda's attempt to divide us with her fraudulent authority had actually brought us closer together. Neighbors who had barely spoken before her reign of terror, became close friends during the fight against her HOA. The annual fireworks celebration became a symbol of what we could accomplish when we worked together instead of letting bullies tear us apart. We established the Crystal Lake Community Association, a legitimate, democratically elected organization focused on organizing social events and maintaining common areas. Unlike Linda's fake HOA, our association had no authority to impose fines or control private property. Its sole purpose was to bring neighbors together for positive community activities. The association now organizes monthly potluck dinners, seasonal festivals, and volunteer cleanup days around the lake. We've created a community garden, installed hiking trails, and established a scholarship fund for local students. Every activity is voluntary, every decision is made democratically, and every dollar is spent transparently. 3 years later, the Crystal Lake 4th of July celebration has become one of the county's most popular events, consistently drawing over 30,000 spectators and generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in tourism revenue for local businesses. I still run the event as a free public celebration, though it now requires a staff of 40 volunteers and coordination with multiple county departments. Thunder Bay Pyrotechnics has expanded their display each year, and we've added live music, food vendors, and family activities that turn the entire weekend into a festival. The festival now includes a 5K run, a fishing tournament, a craft fair, and educational booths about lake conservation and local history. Local businesses sponsor activities, and all proceeds go to the Crystal Lake Community Association Scholarship Fund and environmental preservation efforts. The irony isn't lost on me that Linda's attempt to stop my small backyard fireworks party ultimately created the biggest public event in the county's history and sparked a county-wide movement against fraudulent HOAs. The state legislature even passed new laws requiring transparent disclosure and democratic approval for all HOA formations, largely in response to the investigation that began with Linda's fraud at Crystal Lake. The Crystal Lake Protection Act, as it came to be known, has prevented countless other communities from falling victim to similar scams. But perhaps the most satisfying development came 2 years after Linda's conviction, when I received a letter from the federal prison where she was serving her sentence. The letter was from Linda herself, written in shaky handwriting on prison stationery. She apologized for the harassment and acknowledged that her actions had been wrong. She said that watching the news coverage of the annual fireworks celebrations from prison had made her realize how much joy she had tried to steal from the community. I was angry and scared and trying to control everything because I felt like my life was falling apart, she wrote. I see now that trying to control other people just made everything worse for everyone, including me. I hope someday I can make amends for the damage I caused. I never responded to the letter, but I did share it with the other homeowners at Crystal Lake. Most people felt that it was too little, too late, but I appreciated the acknowledgement. It showed that even the most committed suburban dictator could eventually realize that community cooperation works better than individual control. The story that really shows how much things have changed came last summer, when I received a call from a man named Robert Mitchell, who lived in a subdivision about 50 miles south of Crystal Lake. By Christmas, Linda had put her lakefront mansion up for sale. She moved back to Dallas before the end of the year, leaving behind a community that was stronger, more united, and more committed to protecting each other's rights than ever before. The for sale sign stayed in her yard for 8 months before the house finally sold to a young family from Austin, who specifically mentioned that they were excited about the annual fireworks display. 3 years later, the Crystal Lake 4th of July celebration has become one of the county's most popular events, consistently drawing over 30,000 spectators and generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in tourism revenue for local businesses. I still run the event as a free public celebration, though it now requires a staff of 20 volunteers and coordination with multiple county departments. Thunder Bay Pyrotechnics has expanded their display each year, and we've added live music, food vendors, and family activities that turned the entire weekend into a festival. The irony isn't lost on me that Linda's attempt to stop my small backyard fireworks party ultimately created the biggest public event in the county's history. But the story that really shows how much things have changed came last summer, when I received a call from a man named Robert Mitchell, who lived in a subdivision about 50 miles south of Crystal Lake. "Mr. Chen," he said, "I heard about your situation with the HOA and the fireworks display, and I was wondering if you could help me. My HOA is trying to stop me from flying an American flag, and I think they're using some of the same illegal tactics that woman used on you." I smiled as I looked out at Crystal Lake, where families were already starting to set up their chairs and blankets for this year's fireworks display. "Robert," I said, "let's talk about it. I've learned a few things about fighting HOA bullies, and I'd be happy to share them with you. Because if there's one thing I learned from dealing with Linda Blackwood, it's this: when someone tries to use fake authority to control your life, the best response is to get real authority and use it to protect everyone's freedom." Linda tried to use her fraudulent HOA to stop my fireworks display. Instead, she helped me create the biggest celebration in the county's history and showed an entire community how to stand up to suburban dictators. Every 4th of July, as I watched 30,000 people enjoying the fireworks display that Linda tried to ban, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is just living your best life and inviting everyone else to join you. Trust me, the next HOA Karen who tries to ban someone's fireworks is going to discover that there's more than one way to light up the night sky.